welcome. Central Park. Is it truly threatened by long shadows from a picket fence of super tall, hyper-thin skyscrapers rising near its southern edge? Or is the opposition more a matter of taste or a distaste of the super rich who can spend nearly $100 million for a park view from the 95th floor? We will delve into all that in a moment. Also on our program today, another urban phenomenon, soccer. It's been growing ever more popular in the New York region and certain other cities, and it's not just due to immigration. It's Euro, it's classy, we'll talk about it. Then in our public intellectual segment, where we examine new research with the power to change our minds and public policy, two scholars question the methodology of a study that affirmative action opponents have relied on for a decade. And toward the end of the hour, 50 years of courtroom art. Stay tuned, you might see a sketch of who made off with your money. First, Central Park versus the super scrapers. Looking south, the view from Sheep Meadow currently looks like this, with that one thin super tower on the right. Here's a similar view of the near future with planned or under construction buildings added in orange. And here's another view looking north from Midtown that includes a few more planned structures. Will these towers really shade sunny Central Park significantly? Either way, do we want a city of pencil-thin super towers? And should we get in the way of development that might bring jobs and taxes and a new look? Joining us, Margaret Newman, Executive Director of the Municipal Art Society, and architect Jill Lerner, Principal at Cohn Peterson Fox Associates. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And tell us what kinds of projects are underway. What's your understanding?
Well, along 57th Street, which is what primarily the report was about, we heard from a number of, we often hear from developers and people who are working on projects come and present to the Municipal Art Society. So we got wind of a couple of projects.
And so let me put up a visual right now of the view from the Sheep Meadow, so around 66th Street in Central Park, and talk us through what's coming using this as an aid.
Okay, well, if you go to the, in the middle of the slide, the 111 West 57th Street is just beginning construction, so you won't see that above the tree line for a while. Let's see, the 157 West 57th is the new tower which is under construction, which you can see currently now from Central Park. It's the only one of the group that is actually built. The 432 Park Avenue is well above the building line now, and that's highly visible also. So it's really those two that are visible, both from the park and along 57th Street.
And let's go to the next slide.
Yes, that's the Extel building, which is the 157 West 57th, which is the one that you can see now from the park.
So aesthetically, Jill, for people watching on TV thinking, I really don't like that. Why do I need another thing like that in Midtown Manhattan? And if it's going to block some of the park's sun, no less, why isn't this a monstrosity?
Well, tall buildings are very exciting. They're part of the history of New York. They speak to our aspirations as a great city that's not afraid to take risks and do wonderful new things with new technology. There are lots of, I mean, what would our skyline be if we didn't have our tall buildings? So I think to have a knee-jerk reaction and say we shouldn't be building tall buildings is sort of not a New York reaction, I would say. I think most New Yorkers really are fond of a very, the impact that this has on, you know, our feeling about our city and the importance and the civic nature of a skyline. I think what you're bringing into question is the issue of the quality of the buildings. And will they be, you know, tall behemoths nobody likes to look at, or will they be things that really bring a lot of light and life and action to the skyline in a very positive way? To build this tall, you really need for residential, you need a very robust economy. And it's only been in the last few years that rents have, rates for condominiums and so forth have skyrocketed. So now these are very, very expensive buildings to build because it's expensive to build very tall with very small floor plates.
I think in terms of the history of the skyscraper, I think it's important to note the Empire State Building, which is well over 1,000 feet, was an earlier skyscraper, and one that I think is really iconic for New York's skyline. And so I think in general we love skyscrapers. We love what they represent in terms of the kind of celebration of the city. I think that what I meant about them being a long time in development is that in order to assemble the air rights and the development rights that are necessary to get a tower of this size, it takes a number of years. For instance, the tower we were looking at earlier, those are built based on assembled lots on 57th Street. So you're only going to have one of those towers because the development rights basically on that block are used up. So there's not going to be any more on that particular location.
Which means there isn't really the threat that there will be a wall of these buildings, and they will in effect remain pencil towers in various locations rather than creating sort of a very large wall-like shadow.
And now I think we have a shadows slide. Let's see what comes up here. Right. So, Margaret, maybe you can describe what this is representing. I see this is, I guess this is the southern end of Central Park.
Right, and so this is a shadow study that shows the length of the shadows that would be cast by the various buildings and is a kind of overlay of multiple times of the day, so that at 12 the shadows are much shorter. At 4 p.m. when the sun is much lower, the shadows are substantially longer. And this, I believe, was the one from September. These were taken at constructed at a time when shadows are longest in the spring and the fall.
Right.
So in the summer there'd be shorter shadows because the sun is higher in the sky.
And then the pictures were of places that might be impacted by the shadows as it moves across the park.
So for both of you, because you're not big opponents of this idea, as some people are, how do you balance the public good versus the public bad? People don't want shadows encroaching on Central Park. So as I said in the introduction, some $100 million a year earner can maybe live on the 95th floor, or maybe they're from some other country and they're just using it as investment real estate and don't even live there to create these shadows on Central Park. How do you balance the public good and the public bad?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it is the question, actually, because one of the best benefits of this whole dialogue is that out of this, hopefully, will become a real discussion of should this be something that is reviewed at a larger scale, because property by property, development by development, it's really up to the developer, and these are buildings that, as most people have indicated, are aware, are as of right, which means that they're constructed within the laws of the city. That there's nothing illegal about doing this. There's no special variances. This is something that they are allowed to build. So I think what it prompts is that I think people didn't really anticipate this whole cluster would actually be buildable because of the cost of construction of these types of buildings. And now that it's here, I think it's prompted a discussion of how do we protect our public spaces that are our public open spaces. For instance, there's a sky exposure plane law that means that buildings have to set back at different heights in order to allow enough sunlight onto the street. But there really isn't a sky exposure plane law that deals with public spaces like Central Park, or any major public space. So I think that's the kind of thing that the city could undertake to consider.
I should also just add that when the city builds something, or if a variance is requested for a project when they don't have the sufficient air rights, they will have to go through a review process that includes environmental reviews, which could include shadow studies. It could include impacts on transportation. It could include impacts on local public space, on sidewalks, on increased transportation needed for occupancy in the building. So what I think the reason for our doing the study was really to, going forward, to figure out what's the threshold where a building would require review that would then trigger amenities or contribution to the public realm, so that these buildings, which are hugely expensive to build, as Jill said, they're also not necessarily a great boon to the city economically once they are built. So that you want to make sure that that the city does achieve substantial benefit from them.
What are we looking at here?
New York has a what we call a kind of compositional way of describing zoning, so that there is a it's possible in the upper left that
Right, where the caption is air rights transfer. So if they've only built up in the building to the right to a certain number of feet below the legal height, they can sell those air rights
Yes.
so that the building on the left can build even
exactly
higher.
exactly
It's height and bulk, actually.
right.
Height and bulk combined.
Yes.
And
And then the middle image on the top deals with the sky exposure plane, which is what I was referring to, where buildings are set back from the street. And depending on the width of the street, you know, the city requires a certain amount of, that's how tall you, that affects how tall you can build the building in order to let enough natural light down for the pedestrians, which is really, really important for our city. So.
One of the interesting things, this was from the panel that we just did last week with London, and London actually has some slightly different ways of regulating this, but the slide below that says strategic views shows that London actually has some regulations which has view corridors, which which protects the ability to see certain monuments and landmarks. We don't have that in New York, but it is another way to.
There's a lot of things we could look at and consider, but it's interesting, as one of my partners who does a lot of work in London was saying, that in New York everything is allowed except in certain cases, and then you have to go through a special variance process if you want to build something outside the norm. But to build something within the norm, you could build something, as he said, you know, purple with portholes, and it would be totally allowed.
Right.
But in London, he said nothing is allowed, and everything is required to go through, and everything is a negotiation. So it's not even that there are specific rules in many cases, but everything is actually negotiated. So, you know, very site specific depending on what the views are and so forth. So those are sort of two poles in a way. And if you look around the world, there are different rules that are in place in different places, which are interesting. I mean, the Scandinavian countries regulate the distance from that you can be from the exterior wall, because they have so little natural light and they want natural light to penetrate the buildings. In Shanghai, for instance, you can, every residential building must be maintained, I believe it's 1 or 2 hours a day at the shortest day of the year. They have to have direct sunlight into a residential window. So they distinguish between residential buildings and other types of buildings. So every new building can't block that. So there's lots of different things we could look at.
And if the neighbors were to win, and this whole pencil-thin, super high aesthetic or movement were to be stopped in its tracks in that neighborhood because of the shadows, what do you think would be lost?
Well, I think that's unlikely to happen here. It could happen in other neighborhoods. I think there's.
But is it just because the real estate developers have more power than the park users, or because there's really some greater public good that anybody can make a case for that these should go up?
A greater public good to have them go up?
Correct.
I think that would be a hard case to make, although lately in discussions about the mayor's housing plan, which was just released last week, the notion of density and what that means and how we need to build more densely.
Which often means greater height.
That's right.
For which the developer gets, in exchange for which the developer promises to put in a percentage of affordable units.
Exactly.
But is that the case in any of these,
No,
or these are just luxury towers?
These are only luxury towers. So that's, I think, where we would weigh in, that some sort of review process needs to happen if they meet a certain threshold in terms of either accumulation of a certain number of development rights or height, or impacting. What we're doing now at MAS is to look around the city and see where other places that may be impacted by this type of development. There aren't as many as you would think. There's not that many parks that would provide substantial views that would warrant protection, but there are certainly a number. Waterfront is another place where we would want to take a look at protecting both views and shadows, and looking at when public review and city review and environmental reviews would weigh in.
Last question. Has Mayor de Blasio weighed in on that south of Central Park development corridor, and would he have the power, maybe along with City Council, to stop it if he so chose?
I suppose the mayor can, I think legally he would have a huge battle on his hands. I think it's a done deal. These are permitted buildings. I think also he's very supportive of these larger types of development, not these particular ones, as they don't really contribute, as we said, anything to the affordable housing or fair housing issues. But I think he has been supportive. He has expressed his support for real estate development in the city.
Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Out of the 6 professional sports in America, can you name them, only one came from outside the USA, soccer. Yet its origins are hardly keeping it in the backfield among fans. Currently, it's the fastest growing sport in the country and will probably be next year, too, as the New York Football Club makes its debut at Yankee Stadium. And just this week, Major League Soccer signed record-breaking new deals with major broadcasters, increasing the league's revenue 5 times over. So what's behind the high kick in popularity? Our next guest says it's directly related to what the fans in a given town do for a living. Apparently, New York's creative class finds soccer Class E. Joining us via Skype from California, Patrick Adler, a PhD student in urban planning at UCLA, and with us here in our studio, Peter Strumpf, the president of the Cosmopolitan Soccer League, kind of a precursor to Major League Soccer and one of the oldest soccer leagues in the country. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Peter, tell us about the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. You have many, many teams in the metro area, right?
Yes, we're all over the city, and we had a very ethnic background. You know, years ago, 50, 60 years ago, it was mostly ethnic. However,
Ethnic
today,
meaning immigrants from soccer-playing countries?
Yes.
Meaning mostly Latin America?
No, really more European. Okay.
Because that's who was here at that time.
At that time, yes, that's right. However, later on, the Latin population, they had their own leagues. They didn't really play with us, and one of the reasons was we played from the fall into the spring. They played from the spring into the fall. So that didn't mix, and they had their own leagues.
Who wants to play soccer when it's 20 degrees outside?
We do. I mean, that's what they did in Europe, and that's what we did.
So it's basically adult amateur leagues. Anybody
It's an
can
adult
join
amateur
kind of league.
Pretty much.
So you have to
of course.
try out for the teams?
Yes, it's up to the teams whom they want to take or not. We don't know that, but they're all eligible as far as we're concerned.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's go out to California and ask what you've been studying about the rise in popularity of soccer. We know inch by inch it's starting to get more popular in the United States, but it's slow as a spectator sport, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been slow to emerge here until the last couple of years when you start seeing places like Seattle and Portland just fill to the brim brand new stadia for the purpose of watching a live soccer game.
Fill to the brim in Portland and Seattle. Why would they be the breakout cities?
Well, when you look at Portland and Seattle and places like Toronto and Columbus and charter cities for the MLS like San Jose, from my perspective, which is one which looks at economic structure, you begin to see some commonalities. And these are all metro regions that are oriented around creative work, knowledge work. And yeah, I think it's been quite the surprise that these creative places have been the ones driving the growth of Major League Soccer. And these aren't necessarily places with a lot of immigrants.
So let's put up one of the slides that indicates some of the stats here. And maybe you can help talk us through these. Sport League fandom by metro immigrant share. And what we're seeing is Major League Soccer in blue, because that's the one we're interested in, but that's not the highest by immigrant share. Baseball and football more so, and the NBA too. I mean, baseball and hockey more so, and the NBA too.
That's right. So you've got really big cities like Los Angeles and New York that have teams in all of these leagues. But when you think of cities that only have MLS teams, it's places like Salt Lake City, not necessarily an immigrant hotbed. The same goes for Columbus. So these aren't So when you think of the average MLS city, it does not have a particularly high number of immigrants, but it does have a lot of creative workers.
Sports league fandom by metro creative class share. So this goes right to your point. And so if a metro area has a large proportion of its population in the so-called creative class, there is soccer in blue on the left, all the way up at the top, and then going gradually down through baseball, hockey, football, NBA, and ha ha ha, NASCAR and the creative class do not mix, do they?
Unfortunately, yeah.
So this one kind of demonstrates your thesis
Right.
pretty clearly. So is the New York Football Club going to work?
I really expect it to be successful, if not to begin with, but certainly eventually. I think that they have one of the best coaches we have in this country. Honestly, I think he's terrific.
Who's that?
They got him from Salt Lake City, okay? Jason Kreis is his name. He used to play in the league, and now he's coaching, and from all I know, he's one of the best. So and they know that. That's why they get him.
Yeah.
You know. I want to add one other thing to the World Cup,
Please.
by the way. One of the advantages for this cup is the time zones, okay? Because typically when the U.S. played in Korea, the game was on 2 o'clock in the morning, okay? But playing in Brazil, it's maybe 1 hour behind, okay? So in other words, we can watch it live at a reasonable time, and that should make a big difference. Okay?
And of course, they build these things increasingly for the networks,
Oh, absolutely.
whether
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Olympics or whatever.
There's
And
going to be a game every night, prime time, and you know, who plays, we'll see. But there's going to be a game every night for a couple of weeks.
does the United States have a shot?
Well, first of all, they're in a really tough group. I mean, that's what I think. And do they have a shot?
Because they're
Of
in a
course.
division with certain other countries
Yeah,
who are
with,
really
with
good.
Germany, Portugal, and Ghana. And for instance, they've never beaten Ghana for one reason or another. And it's just tough, but it's tough for the other countries to beat us. I mean, you know, need a little luck. That would help, and we'll see.
Patrick, why the creative class? Does this make intuitive sense to you? The popularity of soccer around the world, I think, is more born of high poverty areas and the fact that you don't need anything but a ball to kick around in an open space. You don't need any equipment. And so anybody can play soccer, and so it grew up in the you know, poor areas all around the world. Does it make sense that it would be a creative class rather than a poverty class, if you will, attraction in the United States?
Well, I mean, when you're talking about the development of any new sports league, especially a sports league that requires new sport-specific stadia, you need lots of money. You need people who are going to pay the season ticket prices that they're essentially going to pay for all these stadia. And in that sense, if you want to grow any sort of sport, you're going to need the support of the high income earners, and that's the creative class here. But I think there's also something kind of more interesting going on with the fact that soccer is, as you said at the Open, the only sort of foreign sport that people turn out en masse to watch in the United States. And everything about soccer is sort of distinct from these American sports we have. In some ways, it's slower. There's less scoring. Some of the traditions that people have, they sort of adopt from abroad, from Europe. You'll never see someone go to an NFL game wearing a scarf for their local team, but this is what people do when they watch soccer. So when you compare all that to theories around creative workers, there's this whole idea that creative workers are attracted to sort of cosmopolitan, no pun intended, ideas, other cultures. They're sort of more globally oriented. And I think soccer really does connect with that part of the creative class theory.
So last word before we go. This is going to take off in New York.
Yes, I have no doubt, being here as long as I am and playing soccer all that time, it's getting bigger, and that's all there is to it. And everybody that comes to New York now has played it. You know, so all the Americans that come from different states and look for a job here, what's the first thing they do? They look for, because they played soccer, to look for other people.
And the kids
it's a
play
social
it.
thing.
And the kids
Absolutely.
play it. In
Absolutely.
addition to all the immigration you're talking
Oh,
about.
yeah.
The kids
Yeah.
play it growing up.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
what's more of a suburban American institution than the soccer mom?
You go to Long Island, they got 120,000 kids playing soccer just in Long Island, okay? So it's here to stay, getting bigger.
All right, we will see what happens. Thank you both very much
Okay, thank you.
for joining us. Up next, Public Intellectual. Two scholars question the famous mismatch study that says affirmative action backfires. Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. In the recent U.S. Supreme Court case, which upheld a state's right to ban affirmative action at public colleges, Chief Justice John Roberts specifically referred to something called the mismatch theory. That's a reference to a 2004 study and later book, which argued that affirmative action backfired at the top law schools, putting students in classes they can't handle, making them more likely to drop out, leading to there being fewer, not more, black lawyers. The mismatch theory is by no means accepted across academia. Nonetheless, the study by UCLA law professor Richard Sander and journalist Stuart Taylor has been influential, but now a new study has crunched the numbers again with different results. The critique, published in the Texas Law Review, is entitled "Still Hazy After All These Years: The Data and Theory Behind Mismatch." Joining us via Skype to discuss their research are authors William Kidder, the Assistant Executive Vice Chancellor at the University of California, Riverside, and Angela Onwuachi-Willig, Visiting Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Welcome to both of you. Professor Onwuachi-Willig, you first. Tell us why you re-examined the mismatch study after so many years.
Well, one reason why we wanted to re-examine the mismatch study is because it has appeal to people who are on the fence. What is more appealing than saying a policy that's meant to help people is actually hurting them? And we wanted to make sure that people had the right data, that they had the correct information about whether this policy, affirmative action, was helping its intended beneficiaries versus hurting them.
And Professor Kidder, what did you find when you took a second look?
So what we tried to do is survey the entirety of the responsible social science out there. What we found is that the strong weight of the evidence, including the best peer-reviewed studies, show that affirmative action, on balance, actually has a net positive effect in terms of underrepresented minority students' graduation rates and later earnings in the labor market. So it was a clear refutation of the mismatch hypothesis.
So, Professor Onwuachi-Willig, for viewers who right off the bat hear the two of you and say, well, okay, you have one study that looked at all the numbers and decided that affirmative action was actually backfiring on those law students who were able to take advantage of it, and your study, which looks at the same data, presumably, and comes to the opposite conclusion, and they go, I don't know, people are just choosing up sides based on their interests. How would you argue against that?
Well, I mean, our argument is that our piece is actually not a particular study. It's more a compilation of all the studies that are out there. And so what our work does is it shows that the vast majority of research weighs on the side of saying that affirmative action is helpful to institutions, it's helpful to students for whom it's intended to help, and it's helpful to students who are at these institutions who are learning from their peers. So we are looking at the weight of all the social science evidence, and overwhelmingly, it falls in favor of affirmative action. And that's what we're pointing out, that when you look at all the best peer-reviewed studies out there, they show that affirmative action is helping its beneficiaries.
Let's look at one table, a graphic from your study as an example, and talk us through this. Professor Kidder, you could start. If you can't see it from where we are, this is Black and Latino graduation rates at high-rated research universities. So tell us what the line in blue is and what the line in orange is, if you can.
Sure, and for clarification, I'm an administrator. I'm not a faculty member here at the university. But the chart that your viewers can see is a simplified version of the table from our article. And basically what it shows is that African American and Latino students at the most selective universities have the highest graduation rates. As you go down from the 20 most selective to the next group of 20 to the middle group of 20 and so on, you see that the graduation rates for African Americans and for Latinos drops considerably. The other takeaway from the data, and you don't see this in the chart, but it's related, is that the graduation rate gaps, the size of the difference in comparing African American students versus white students, for example, the size of that gap widens considerably as you go to the less selective universities.
And this is so important, Professor Onwuachi-Willig. I'm going to leave this up here again for a minute. You teach at Yale, which I'm sure is in the 1 through 20 category somewhere. So all the way on the left there, if you're in a harder school, both to get into and to succeed in, and you've gotten in through affirmative action, you're more likely to graduate than at some of the lesser schools. That's exactly what this is showing. So let me ask you, why do we have the theory out there that just the opposite is true? That if people are getting extra points for being minorities on their admissions applications, and therefore getting into universities that might be academically above their heads because they're academically below the other people who are getting in because they're getting this leg up on other criteria, that's the critique. Why does that not apparently hold water here?
Well, I think to begin with, the entire theory rests upon sort of a misrepresentation of the admissions process, a misrepresentation of what it means to be a qualified student. So schools, elite schools, selective institutions have far fewer spots than there are qualified students. And there are a range of qualified students, and schools look at a wide range of information in determining who should be admitted into these institutions among that qualified pool. So individualized review looks at test scores, it looks at GPA, it looks at activities, it looks at those intangible qualities that people will bring to an institution that will help to advance the mission of the school. And the mismatch theory basically sums up qualification up to test scores and GPA, and then says if there's any kind of gap between test scores, averages for groups, not for individuals, but averages for groups, and that means those groups in general are unqualified to be at the institution. And so part of it is, in general, it's not really in our piece, but in general, the way in which they determine merit and qualification should be challenged. And then I'd also say that just as a matter of intuition, mismatch, if there is such a thing as mismatch is what we want for our kids. That we don't say we want our kids to be when we're playing sports. We don't say we want our kids to play sports with people who are just as good as they are to get better, or people who are worse players than they are to get better. We said we want our kids to play with people who are going to challenge them and they're going to rise to the occasion.
And Vice Chancellor Kidder, I think I've got your title right. Do we learn from this then that whether people think affirmative action is good or not for whatever reasons of social fairness or race-blind idealism or whatever the reasons are that they may like it or not like it, what you're really trying to demonstrate here is that it helps the people who get admitted based partly on affirmative action. In other words, don't use the beneficiaries as an argument against themselves, that's what you're disproving.
Brian, I think that's well stated. Basically, there are two different kinds of arguments for or against affirmative action. There's one set of arguments that are essentially a moral or political kind of argument. And then there's another set of arguments that's empirically based. It's trying to make the claim that empirically affirmative action is a good thing or it is not. The mismatch adherents are arguing on empirical grounds that affirmative action is an unwise policy. And what we try to show with great specificity in this article is that that, as an empirical claim, is not well substantiated. That Sander and Taylor, for example, have really cherry-picked the data.
Now, when you say they cherry-picked the data for the original mismatch study, are you accusing them of systematic bias because they had an agenda?
I leave it for others to conclude the reasons why one might cherry pick the data. But we've gone through in a great level of detail to show how the claims that they make, not just in Sanders' 2004 article, but mainly in the recent book Mismatch that came out in 2012, how those claims just do not hold up to close scrutiny.
And I would think, Professor Onwuachi-Willig, and then we're out of time, that this is a self-correcting problem, if it is a problem. I happen to be on a round of college tours with my own high school son, and we're listening to the admissions info presentations, and in one after another, they talk about looking for students who they think are going to make it through the 4 years to graduation. They don't want to admit somebody who's going to drop out of their school because the school is going to look bad if they have a high percentage of people who don't finish. I'm sure that's true in law school as well. And so I would imagine this is self-correcting. If they're admitting populations of students who aren't succeeding, then they're going to not use those same criteria next year.
Yeah, so I think that you're right, and definitely in one sense you're right that schools have an incentive to focus on choosing the best students, the students that best advance their own mission, to attend the institution because they want to have high graduation rates, which help to attract more students, which help with a number of factors, including U.S. News rankings. Right. But I think the other thing that I would also make a comment, and this goes more to the moral component that Mr. Kidder brought up, is that one of the questions we have to ask ourselves in education is, do we want to have an educational system where we've left the door open only for those students who are the most advantaged, who are the most privileged? And so much of what we know is that the way in which we the focus only on test scores really rewards and advantages those students who come from the most socioeconomically successful families, and that there is racial bias in some of these tests. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as a moral matter is, are we leaving our doors open, our doors of education open, to all kinds of students who are qualified, who can succeed at these institutions, and who can advance those institutions' missions?
Well, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful.
O.J. Simpson, Bernie Madoff, the Iran-Contra affair. High-profile court cases have a way of grabbing the public's attention. But sometimes access to these historic cases can be limited. Here in New York and in many other places, cameras are banned. Reporters can describe what unfolded, but pictures have their own power, right? Well, that's where courtroom illustrators come in, capturing pivotal moments and faces in a flash, or rather in the stroke of a pen, often producing the only visual remnants of major cases. Now, a new book pieces together court art from 5 artists who covered legendary American court cases over the last half-century. The book is called The Illustrated Courtroom, 50 Years of Court Art. It's authored by one of the artists, Elizabeth Williams, and crime journalist Sue Russell, and published by the CUNY Journalism Press. With us is Elizabeth Williams and her fellow court artist, Aggie Kenny, whose works feature prominently in the book. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
We're going to show a lot of images in just a minute. Well, in fact, let's just put something up. I think our first one here.
Oh, that's right, the Russian spies.
Anna Chapman on the left, the Russian spy.
Well, when, I'll just tell you, when Anna Chapman walked into the courtroom, it was so clear that she was going to be the main story. She walked in, she was like a beacon. Her hair, after being in the lockup, looked like she had been blown dry, like she'd gone to a salon. She sat down and looked over the courtroom, and I was able to get that look sort of facing me. And that drawing ended up on the Yahoo News most recommended news image list because that was the only picture of Anna Chapman out for quite some time. I just got very lucky.
And so much was made about how she was attractive as
Ah.
well as how she was a spying defendant.
Absolutely, and I saw, and I could immediately tell the James Bond, Anna Chapman connection, Russian spies. I mean, it all sort of, everything sort of came together in that one moment. And I thought, you know, I just got lucky, and I got the picture.
Aggie, how does one become a court artist? Do you wake up when you're 7 years old and say, I want to become a courtroom artist, Daddy?
Well, I think you wake up when you're 3 years old and you start drawing and it becomes a passion. And I consider myself fortunate in being directed this way. It's been just a wonderful ride to be able to draw and paint to my heart's content for many years.
All right, slide number 2.
Oh, that's Howard Brody's drawing of the spectators during the Watergate trials. One of the things that Howard has passed away, but we went out and interviewed him in his studio before he passed on. And one of the things he talked about was the spectators, during the Watergate trial, they would come in such crazy outfits, and they were this sort of like hippie-looking group, and yet the trial itself was all these men in suits. And there was this sort of dichotomy between the spectators and the defendants and the lawyers. And one woman actually showed up in I remember, a pink football helmet and a boa.
Huh.
And we never found the picture of the pink football helmeted woman, but this was such a memorable issue for him. We wanted to put that in the book. And
So, spectators and a security officer, and
Yes.
Aggie, I think we have one of yours from the Watergate era.
Oh, no, that's actually
that's
Howard.
Howard again.
That's
Oh.
Howard.
Yeah.
That's Ehrlichman and Halderman and Mitchell over there. That's the whole. That's the second trial. Oh, that's Aggie's. Yes.
Yes.
All right, so this is
John Mitchell
During the Mitchell
at the
stands.
Mitchell Stands trial.
more Watergate. Now, do we see these things from the perspective of where you're sitting? We saw Anna Chapman and those other folks from the back.
Yeah.
We saw the hippies gathering to watch this trial from the side, and we're seeing these guys head on. Is that what it is? It really just depends on where you are?
Yes, we're always battling for a wonderful vantage point. It was a little difficult at the Mitchell Stands trial, and we artists resort to binoculars often to be able to
See
zoom
meticulous
in.
facial expressions.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Because also the lighting can play a role. Aggie covered the Jerry Sandusky case, and we've both been in that courtroom. That got very kind of funny lighting. You need binoculars to really see.
And you've both covered the mafia. So let's go to our next slide. And Elizabeth, what case is this? Is one of yours, right?
Yes, that's one of mine. That
For
is
NBC
Paul.
News?
That is Paul Castellano. That is Paul Castellano and his co-defendants before he was shot outside of Sparks Steakhouse. You know, obviously we did not know he was going to be
Which
rubbed.
one is he?
He's
Is he in the blue suit?
He's the far right. And at the time,
The far right.
the profile
On the
with the
far right.
glasses. He walked into court. I will never forget this. He would stroll into court with his top coat on and a cigar in his mouth, and he was a big man. And I mean, and at the time when we're doing this drawing, we aren't realizing it was the whole scene of the Castellano, the Gambino crime family. That was the real issue. Not so much he was important, but it was more that was the trial. Then once he was, murdered, all of a sudden, sort of the idea of him being the Castellano was head of that crime family was a big issue. And then we started going over to cover John Gotti.
More mafia. Aggie, I think this is one of yours.
Yes, that is. That's John Gotti on the extreme left, and behind him Bruce Cutler, his attorney, who eventually was severed from. Was it this case, Liz?
No, it
or-
was the later case, the last case where Gotti was acquitted at this trial. This was in front of Eugene Nickerson. Yeah, and
So when you're drawing guys like this, do you try to just portray as accurate a representation of them as you can, or are you caricaturing at all and trying to make the guys who most of the world thinks are sinister look a little sinister?
Well, personally, I try to be as accurate as possible, and that might not be the final judgment, but that's what I shoot for.
yeah, that's what we're supposed to shoot for. And indeed, even the Associated Press has guidelines, and they're very strict. I do a lot of work for them. There is absolutely not supposed to be any editorializing in the artwork at all, because it's journalism, it's news.
So forget about the mafia. Let's show Martha Stewart.
Oh, Martha.
And her day of court. Elizabeth, this is one of yours too,
Yeah,
right?
that's one of mine. Yeah, Martha was tough. She, for one thing, she did not turn around very much. For the other thing, she was very emotionally controlled. So you were never going to get an emotional reaction out of her. And it really, I have to say, through all the weeks of that trial, not much at all. She had a little bit of a pained expression there, far left, with her when her attorney Robert Morvillo made his opening statement. But for the most part, and plus Martha was tough to draw because she's a very pretty, beautiful woman, but she has a sort of definite sense of power, and so you try to capture that. It was a little tricky.
It's funny, these powerful defendants,
Yeah.
Stewart and Castellano in a different way, and Anna Chapman you described as looking like she was in charge of the world. And these people are defendants in court. They may be going away for who knows how long, and yet they come in with a lot of swagger.
Oh yes, they certainly do. Especially, you know, the mafia. They have, and John Gotti certainly did.
So much more sinister than Martha Stewart.
Yeah.
That's David Berkowitz, son of Sam, isn't it?
I just think that's a magnificent, accurate portrait by Richard Tomlinson. And he and I sat together in lockdown at the Kings County Psychiatric Hospital. And he just produced something, I think, extraordinary.
Capturing that, what's the word, murderous, crazy man's face. And is this one of yours now in the Son of Sam trial?
Yes, this is in lockdown at Kings County Hospital. And as I said, I sat very close to Richard Tomlinson, and he produced that crazy image. And and this is an example of how crazy he was. When I saw him, I rendered him more cherubically, and I found there was a disconnect between this sort of cherubic face I saw and the heinous crimes he committed.
How many pictures do you draw on a typical full day in court?
That's very hard to answer. I think you have to talk about what era we're talking about. In the 70s and 80s, I know I had more time to bring out my gouache and watercolor, and working for Network, they didn't use necessarily the illustrations every night, so you had more time to develop, like at the Supreme Court, to develop something detailed. Now, I'm working quite small, a pen, watercolor, and
because the 24-hour online news cycle
Absolutely.
demands product
Absolutely.
attached to a story or not.
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. And there is always this sort of, these two factors are facing you: quality and deadline. So you've got to determine, like, how good is the artwork going to be, and where is the deadline, and they need to meet. They need to meet. And what's interesting about the book is that the way we feel is I mean, the way it's all been done is that artwork, when it was finished and handed in, has never been embellished. All that artwork was, when it was done, that's the way it was done, and nobody has touched that.
no photoshopping.
No photoshopping, nothing else.
Right.
So that is, I mean, that's kind of the way courtroom art is anyways, but it's even more so now.
4 great drawings of Oliver North by Aggie Kenny. One with the judge seeming skeptical in the background.
Yeah,
What's there?
That was Ollie North's mother and father and wife, and I often am really struck by oddities in the courtroom, and that hat really blew me away.
And another one.
And that's Fawn Hall, a gorgeous woman who...
His assistant, is that the
Yes.
right term?
that-
Yes, from an associate of Oliver North from back then, and one
Who
more.
helped, and that's Bud McFarlane, who was John Poindexter's boss, and he certainly experienced a fall from grace, and I saw him and I think pictured him as a broken man.
And from Oliver North, we go to Suleiman Abu Ghaith. Elizabeth, this is yours for the Associated Press. Is this
Yes.
very recent?
That's pretty recent. That was actually his arraignment, and I just covered his the verdict in his trial. where
That's
he
the
was found
Osama
guilty.
bin Laden driver who was
That's Osama bin Laden's son-in-law.
son-in-law, forgive me, who was on trial here in New York.
Right, and he was the mouthpiece for Al Qaeda, and they played the tapes that he produced, and that were sent out over Al Jazeera, and the jury found him guilty pretty quickly. So yeah, yes,
I guess
covered
these
it.
high-profile cases, you're shooting one infamous character, or I should say drawing, one infamous character after another.
Right.
James Earl Ray, Aggie, this is yours, and of course that's who shot Martin Luther King.
Yes. This was a hearing, a 5-day hearing, I believe it was 5 days, in Memphis. And he was trying to have his guilty plea rescinded. And I was just totally struck by him. His hair was in disarray, the short white socks with his legs showing between the socks and the trousers. And
So great.
Did I hear that he married one of the courtroom artists?
Yes. At one point, just after he escaped from Bushy Mountain Prison, he was captured, and I was sent by CBS to cover a courtroom hearing in the cafeteria. And beside me sat a blonde local artist. And it came to my attention that a while later, she married James Earl Ray.
So sometimes you sit there, Elizabeth, and you're drawing an infamous defendant, and you think, cute.
I don't know if I
No.
I don't know if I've ever had that.
Not quite like that. All right, one more, two more, one more definitely cute.
Oh boy, that's O.J. Simpson, our colleague in Los Angeles. The artist Bill Robles, who drew the picture of Manson on the cover, drew O.J. Simpson and covered both the trials, the criminal trial. That is the criminal trial, and he had to have his jury drawings stamped by Judge Ito because the judge got very upset with him, claiming that the jury pictures were supposed to be anonymous, but they were looking a little bit too much like the jury.
Wow.
So he kind of made news himself with that. So
And
every drawing was now stamped. and
Last
approved.
one, not cute.
Who's the
And
last
this
one?
is yours, Elizabeth.
Oh yeah, that's Bernie Madoff. Definitely not cute. No, no, that's the sentencing, and that other one was as his initial courtroom hearing, courtroom appearance, I should say, and that's Aggie's drawing of the sentencing, and their area is going to prison. That one was the really the highlight.
And-
I'll tell you. of
And
those
people know
drawings.
him from the back.
Yes.
You know, if most journalists who don't do what you do got their way, you would probably be out of business.
Oh,
because they
definitely,
want
yeah.
to see cameras in the courtroom,
Absolutely.
stills and video.
Sure.
Do you think if that ever were to come to pass universally, that something journalistic would be lost, not just something aesthetic?
I think that the cameras in the courtroom are a simple matter of time. And it's just a fact that it's going to happen. They're testing them in federal courts throughout the country and other areas. And that's one of the reasons why I think that compelled me to want to write the book and to get the book done. Because what's odd about it is the television news industry is really responsible for I would say 80–90% of the artwork that's in that book, and I would say the plethora of artwork that exists now from the 60s to current day is because of the television news business. They are an image-driven business, and they need images, and that's why there's so much artwork and so many things available to us. And this was a period of time where it was a sort of the halcyon days of courtroom art. This is when courtroom art really flourished, and there were some wonderful artists, and it won't happen again. There's a handful of us left in New York. There's a handful of us left in LA. It's petered out, but this has captured the great days of courtroom art, and so that's why.
Hence all those images that you've been seeing collected in the Illustrated Courtroom, 50 Years of Court Art. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And that's our program for this week. You'll find a new show here each week at this hour. Next time, transient teens, often white kids with high school diplomas. So what are the risk factors and what are they doing out there? And do tune into my radio program weekday mornings, 10 a.m. to noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, Sandra Tsing Loh on what she calls Not Your Grandmother's Menopause Story. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.